can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. I think I'd like to begin this episode by quoting Anais Nin. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. The reason I've suggested that we ponder that quote is that I think in an age where it's becoming ever more clear to coaches, they need to be reflective as practitioners. They need to continuously sort of throw topics around inside your head to try to continuously make sense of your experiences through a sustained, level of introspection around, events that have occurred, how they made you feel, what reasoning you can see behind the outcome, what you would do differently, how you're going to apply that learning going forward. And it's so important, because that is, it's the fastest way of getting better as a practitioner, as a coach, is to become ever more reflective and hopefully ever more self-aware. And the reason that I say hopefully ever more self-aware is that I do not think it's a guarantee that being a reflective coach ensures self-awareness. I believe that self-awareness comes from being a reflexive coach who also reflects. So reflexivity and reflective practice aren't the same thing. So a reflective conversation is one where I try to make sense of an event. A reflexive conversation is at the conclusion of that reflective conversation, I have to undergo a fact-checking of my own conclusions. And the reason for this is that as humans, we are fallible to our own bias. We are raised in completely unique environments. Or it's not even so much unique, but we all have our own backstories, our own biography, our own history. We think and say the things that we do today. We believe the things we believe today because of things that have happened to us in the past, because of the information we receive around us, which again is not consistent. Okay? That information is vulnerable to cultural influence, to paternal influence, to, your educational pathway, to episodic experiences, to the continual over years and years thoughts that you have went through. So it's not that we can't trust ourselves, but because with experience sometimes we acquire expertise, and through reflective practice we can get better, or at least we can continue further down a path of change. But do we ever stop and consider, are we fact checking why we think the way we think? Are we considering what influences are there on the conclusions that I'm reaching? Because if we aren't thinking that way, we could be going down a rabbit hole of continuously changing or improving or refining practice that actually is still subpar, or if not subpar, certainly isn't reaching the limits of our own potential, and could, at its worst, be nothing other than a sort of dressed up reproduction of what we've always done. Because at the core philosophy of our thoughts and our beliefs and the values that we carry forward into practice, we may not be sieving out the parts that are holding us back, because we aren't facing up to the realities of being a person who is innately biased and carries with them an agenda that may not always be correct. Now, bias, this isn't necessarily an onslaught on bias. I believe that actually, for the same reason that we have to pay attention to our bias, we can also be doubly proud of our bias, because more often than not, all the good intentions that we carry forward into the world when we coach come often from positive experiences that we may have had, have come from negative experience that we may have had, whether it be as an athlete, because obviously we go through that apprenticeship of learning often, from playing the game to then wanting to coach the game, whatever that sport is, and in turn that sometimes allows us to go, do you know what, I want to be this person, I want to be different from how I was coached, or I want to be very much like the person I was coached, and I want to carry on the good practice of my mentors and other people who have been good to me and have been good to others, and that's great. And it allows us it's actually our own biographies that allow us to identify as individuals what certain participants may need, and actually what the game, the sport, the culture that we operate within, what that needs. So bias can be a great thing, but it just needs to be investigated, because you aren't always sure that your bias is on the right side of things, or that it's universally applicable, or that it is always guaranteed to be looking at a problem in the right way. So I'm going to go through a couple of different sorts of bias to sort of illustrate this point. Let's look at confirmation bias as one example. So, and try and hopefully see how that illustrates why we could go through a very well-intentioned, reflective conversation, but ultimately come out at the other side with still a fairly foggy view on events. Okay, so there are lots of things that we will believe, okay, and it may even be something that we believe about our environment, our club, our organisation, that we go, do you know what, this is why things are not going right. Or with this player, this athlete, this sport participant, this is why things aren't going right. I'm sure about it. I'm sure. I haven't found the evidence just yet, but I'm sure I've got this hunch, and then it'll be all right. I finally found that evidence that proves I'm correct. Now, to what extent were you trying to actually prove yourself correct? How much effort did you put into trying to find a narrative and trying to sustain a narrative, more than you were perhaps trying to look at a problem from different angles? So confirmation bias can lead us down an avenue of the ways in which we reach a conclusion through the methods that we employ, that we're always sort of read towards one outcome. Okay, and confirmation bias as a coach can be dangerous for that reason, because it impacts our role frame. So we could see a role frame as sort of like a perceptual filter through which we might see the world, through which we might see and view our practice. Our role frames allow us to identify successes, they allow us to identify the things to look for, the things to appraise. They help us sort of bracket what matters and what doesn't matter based on the context in which we coach, and we can use that to reflect in action, to reflect on action after the event, to look at our practice and decide what needs our attention versus what doesn't. And then from there, that steers that reflective conversation. But again, if you're looking for things as opposed to exploring problems or clues and trying to see what may be going on to fit whatever the issue is that's happening with your athlete, we need to be reflexive in order to identify that we have a confirmation bias possibly at play. Similarly, there's such a thing called availability heuristics. And what this essentially is where we base judgments on how easily examples come to mind. So One that's you hear quite often in youth sport is the whole relative age effect. For this is just one example where, we know that statistically speaking, a lot of players that are born in the first quarter of the year often are selected, often are found to be represented more heavily at the top end of the game of sport in professional quarters than players perhaps born later in the year, because they're seen as having a biological advantage. Okay, and there's lots of examples that will come to mind on that. Now, how many times, I'm doing reflect and be reflexive around this as well. I've noticed the amount of times where I see a kid and he's a bit bigger than other kids, and he's also a good player and he's playing really well. And if I wasn't being reflexive to consider how easily that it is to come up with other examples to form a conclusion on this player, I could so easily be saying, do you know what, the only reason he's playing well is because he's physically mature, he's born in the first quarter of the year, this is relative age effect, this is what always happens, so this is what's happening right now. Well, it could be true, but it might not be. You might actually be seeing a player who is a wee bit bigger, but maybe the reason he's actually having success in the game isn't a biological reason. Maybe it's actually, or at least not to do with the physical stature of the player, but indeed maybe they've got good self-regulation skills, their decision-making's good, maybe they've got good sort of cognitive perceptive skills, in terms of how they're able to see and analyse the environment. There's other skills that might be on hand here, and it's a disservice then to that player, and actually it's almost like sort of rubbishing, where there is real quality coming out of a player that should be congratulated on merit. But again, availability heuristics can blind us to that. And that might have, and again, you might have came to the end of a reflective conversation in that player. If you weren't reflexive, you weren't careful to consider that, you might then go and take on another whole stage of action that isn't accurate. Then we need to think about things like anchoring bias. So you'll watch a player maybe one time, and maybe they lose the ball, or maybe they do something that's not so great insofar as they have a bit of a snap at a teammate, and then you can go, well, look, if you're not careful and you rely too heavily on that first piece of information that we count, and that's what anchoring bias is, you might go, right, this is a weakness, we need to focus on this part of the game, that's a notable weak point. Okay, now firstly there's two parts to that then. Our eyes lie. Okay, there's a reason why performance analysis is now becoming ever more important as part of the review process in coaching, because we identify things that are subjective, and again, consider being reflexive. You might be going into matches with a predisposition towards watching for certain things and overlooking others. Okay, and if you've then jumped in the first bit of information you've found, then this is where you can see sometimes a combination of confirmation bias coming in and anchoring bias. Okay, you could come to a conclusion that isn't actually right about that player. Okay, I mean, that might be the first time you've watched the player and they did have a particularly bad game. Okay, but that actually wasn't their base average, and maybe actually performance analysis metrics might show up even larger deficiencies or strengths that you might base conversations around. That's why there's a bit more of a push towards, why don't we actually use objective analysis at the point of considering what the problem is, at the start of that point of considering where to look, and let that guide us as opposed to the other way around. Similarly, in the way to watching a player, someone just tells you about the fact that they've lost the ball, and you might start to then hone in on that as well. So we have to be mindful of not trusting the first piece of information that we encounter. Overconfidence bias. I see this a lot in coaches. They've been coaching for a long time, and they unconditionally equate experience with expertise. Now, there's a really famous quote by academics Gilbert and Trudeau, and it goes like this: 10 years of coaching with no reflection, and I would maybe add to that, and reflex on, is 1 year of coaching repeated 10 times. So, just because you've acquired more years of experience, are you actually getting better? And what can often happen in terms of an overconfidence bias is we can very quickly, coaching's a funny game, that if we're not clever and not humble actually, and maintain a sort of intellectual humility, we can very quickly feel like we're figuring everything out. And that can turn us off. That can make us blind sometimes to our own deficiencies. It can make us unreceptive to alternative viewpoints. Because if we don't turn down the volume in our own internal dialogue, we might not recognise that we still don't know everything. Okay, and then again, that reflective conversations when and if we do have it, it comes to a conclusion and ends at a point where it should have maybe just have started, and we're not actually got any further forward in our expertise. But again, our reflective practice is undermined by the hubris. It's quite a big word, but the arrogance or the overconfidence that should have been revealed through more reflexive practice, where we really are interrogating: do I trust the way I'm thinking here, knowing that I'm fallible as a person? I'm open to bias. We also see things like attribution bias, which is a sort of, again, I'm now starting to go towards more as a self-development thing here, but where again, sometimes we look back on our development journey, and this may even have more implications in terms of as a mentorship relationship that you may have, that indeed maybe you're responsible for looking after someone, and it could be like you may have achieved success in coaching because you attribute it to internal reasons alone, or at least predominantly. You know, you think, I made my own luck, I worked really hard, I went and done this. And for you and for your story, that's fine, but you could then unintentionally start to bias or have a bias against people who don't seem to be maybe meeting the milestones you would hope or what you'd expect when you compare them to your own journey. And if we're not careful, we can judge people based on standards and based on a starting point that we had that they never had. And again, that's really important in a sort of coach developer mentorship role, to understand that you could have had it far worse than this person, but you also could have had it far better. And again, how you attribute success will be and will have implications for how you have reflective conversations, perhaps in development needs of the person that you are also trying to help. It could still be a coach to player aspect to this as well. Maybe you got somewhere in the game yourself and you attribute it to these values, but yeah, that wee boy or wee girl, how you don't necessarily know the starting point they've had. You've not experienced it, you've not lived it. So again, that can be the case as well. Another aspect of bias that we encounter often is very simply put, is the bandwagon bias. So in coaching, there's a lot of things that are very popular to say. Okay, like, you know, game-based practices are the best. We must be athlete-centered all the time. These are the things that we hear routinely, okay? And we can be very prone to basing reflective conversations that we have with ourselves on these benchmarks of effectiveness. But who's to say that the benchmarks of effectiveness that you hear are maybe contextually inappropriate, or at least not as important for certain moments than in others? So who's to say that drilling can't still be useful at certain times for your players, but you've perhaps missed out on a reflective conversation that would allow you to learn a bit more about maybe memory and the role that can play in technical refinement and breaking down skills into its constituent parts and working in the mechanics of skills, because you never allowed yourself to have a reflective conversation that incorporated that sort of language. And at any point, you always were fed information about ecological design, things like game-based design, where it's like, it's not, and I'm not saying that to try to challenge where there's a lot of evidence to suggest like that for example is very good, but you've missed out on coming to that conclusion yourself. You've been fed a narrative, and it's always better, you need to be an independent thinker. Do you think the way you think about coaching because it's how you think, or is it because that's what you've been told to think? Because as much as sometimes we like to tell ourselves it's because of how you think, have you actually traced back who influences your practice? Why did you think this way in the first place? You could surprise yourself, okay? coaching, particularly in terms of we consider the different subcultures within different sports, the dominant narrative is a powerful force. It's policed. There's invisible power that influences us to maintain the status quo in a lot of ways. And I don't think that's useful. That's not helpful for innovation. How can we think outside of the box if your entire reflective conversation's always anchored down by rhetoric, or not even rhetoric, but by a narrative that could be incomplete, that could and probably will and should have margins, have grey parts to it. You may think in black and white because you haven't considered deeply enough why you think the way you think and who told you to think that way. And do you really believe it if you were to go back to it now, completely blind, and have a more inductive look at things? Can you guarantee and can you promise yourself that you would still come to the same conclusions? Even if you still think you would, go and explore alternative viewpoints. Because if you've never explored them, you don't know if you do actually agree with what you think or if it's just all you knew in the first place. And again, we want our reflective conversations that we have with ourselves or with the help of others to lead us to ever more expert practice. But if we aren't being reflexive enough to consider the bandwagon bias, we're cutting ourselves short. Stereotyping, another one. This can influence us as coaches. I have a conversation with Gordon McClelland, which is in another episode that you can go and watch, and I definitely recommend that you do. And it taught me a lot about being reflexive in the way that I approach parents, because I always used to say, parents are always a pain. So this next one's going to end up acting up eventually and all, if not straight away. And it's like, if I treat parents that way, no wonder parents are eventually going to become quite rebellious or we're never going to rub their own way, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And again, if I'm not conscious of my own stereotypes and how I carry prejudice into certain conversations, I'm never going to be able to handle and I'm never going to be able to move past it. And then I'm going to continuously perhaps need to continue to have a reflective conversation on problems that shouldn't exist in the first place. So again, we're seeing where the lack of reflexive thought could be undermining your professional development as a coach through blurring or distracting your reflective conversation towards topics that shouldn't be occupying your mind in the same way as others. So I say this point because for me, I'm not the best coach in the world, but one of the main things that has allowed me in recent years to have a sharp increase in quality was forever building up greater self-awareness of myself. Knowing yourself, you might call that emotional intelligence. If you know yourself better, you can manage yourself better, and you can at least, in terms of coming back to to what we want to assist with, you can at least turn over yourself inside your head in these reflective conversations in a way that's more honest, more authentic, okay, in a way that allows you to self-discover, so you can do something about the parts of yourself that, upon second look, upon investigation, don't sit as well, or at least create a disruption to your schema, and therefore bring about a reorganisation of thought that was always meant to be the true intention of any reflective conversation. So we need to think this way. I'll end on one story that always stuck into my head for the need to be reflexive, to ask that second question, to get to a conclusion and then ask questions of your conclusion, to not be satisfied with an answer alone, but to ask the question of that answer, to have that second layer, to verify your own thoughts, to fact check. So I always remember when I first made the transition from sort of like grassroots coaching into academy coaching. It was one of the first training sessions that I had working under a coach, and a great coach. And I put together a practice. It was sort of like your kind of typical sort of line drill. Okay, set it all up and planned it in advance. Got the boys to do it, but people were chatting in the queue. when people were doing it, there was no tempo like I had envisioned it. Every time when it got to a person's turn, they were distracted, and it made me really angry. And I remember at the time I ended up snapping at one of the players. I was like, "Stop doing that! What he's doing?" I stopped to practice. I was like, "Boys, this isn't good enough." And then I kind of dragged them through the remainder part of it. It got to the drinks break. I let them go, and I turned around to the more senior coach that was working with me at the time. I said, "What are they like, honestly?" And I always remember the sort of look of, "I'm not quite there with you," in his face, to say, "Well, consider what you gave them." And that triggered to me a new layer of introspection of, well, fair enough. Because I was reflecting in the moment. I came to my own conclusion, but I hadn't then interrogated or second guessed my own conclusion. And actually, upon reflection, upon reflexive thought, I started to realise, you know what? Of course they acted in that way. They were waiting too long between practices of the exercise. They're also children. Children are going to laugh and talk to each other. Of course they are. Why am I blaming kids from being kids? I now understand the real reason for this was I was so anxious about doing well because I was relatively new in that space and I wanted to impress the coach that I was getting flustered and I was having an issue with chaos, with a bit of chaos and disorganisation. It was me that was the problem. And at the time, I probably felt that I was a pretty competent coach and I didn't know. And really, in reality, I didn't know how much I didn't know. So my confirmation bias at the point was probably forcing me to want to believe that it's the kids are like, oh, the kids what they like, or, a bit of stereotyping in there as well. But I had to be honest and go to that second level. So don't just look at the event and think, why did that event occur? But think, why am I thinking the event occurred the way that I'm thinking? Check yourself. Okay? Fake news is real, guys. Fake news affects coaches. It affects the quality of our reflection because we need to be reflexive in order to counter our human bias, which can very much get in the way of our development. So hopefully that's been of use to you guys. I'll always be on the bandwagon, to put it aptly, of learning as much about yourself as a coach as what you can, and it will really propel you to help learn more about others and those that you affect. So guys, thanks very much for listening. Until next time.